18th century. You go to an ancient cemetery. We have some old cemeteries. In fact, the town I live in is the second oldest town in the entire region, settled by the Irish, Scotch-Irish in the early 1700s. And you go to the cemetery where we have Revolutionary War soldiers that are entombed there. You look at that cemetery, what do you see? You see family plots, and you see children that were affected by contagious diseases that wiped out children in their adolescent years, as well as younger years. But those that made it past that, you see them in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. So if the average age of children that was dying, let's say you take a 14-year-old and you add it up to an 80-year-old, that's 95 years old, divided by 2, and you're under the age of 50. People didn't live to be 47 and 48 and then die. That wasn't old age. It was the average life expectancy. So it's a statistical sort of manipulation. This is recent, 2009, isn't it? The American Medical Association. See how I'm saying we're starting to get into critical mass. When the American Medical Association says industrial food production is a significant contributor to increased antibiotic resistance, climate change, air and water polluters, they say local and organic foods reduce fuel emissions, contribute to cleaner air, lower the incidence of asthma and other respiratory problems. And AMA supports practices, policies in medical schools, hospitals that support and model a healthy and ecologically sustainable food system, which provides food and beverages of naturally high nutritional quality. I never thought I would live to see the day that was in writing. Never in my lifetime would I ever think. Now, what comes of it is another issue. That's up to us. But the fact that the American Medical Association, which to me was the medical antichrist, come out and say something like this in writing, they even know that we're out of bullets. We can't fix this problem unless we go back to where the origins of the fixing begins, which is in our diet and in our ecological stewardship practices on the farm. And this is one of the things that really changed our health profile here, is the beginning of the fast food industry back in the 60s. And you can see in 1970, it was a $6 billion industry. And in 2000, it was a $110 billion industry. More combined than autos, computers, and college education is in fast food. 1/5 of the meals are eaten in cars in America. Americans feed 1/3 of their children daily in fast food restaurants. And when you look at the diabetic equations, now this is where the rubber meets the road. We have 35% of the Caucasian children born in the year 2000. That means 9-year-olds today. 35% of the Caucasians, 42% of the African Americans, and 52% of the Hispanic children are going to get type 2 diabetes. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is that diabetes is number one cause of stroke, number one cause of blindness, number one cause of lower limb amputation, and the number one cause of kidney dialysis. All of those things are big ticket items. They're incredibly expensive to have a society burdened with 1 out of 3 children with those kinds of chronic conditions. It's going to completely destroy anything economically or health-wise. It's even going to destroy the culture when you have 1 out of 3 children becoming adults with type 2 diabetes, which is totally preventable. And the good news is reversible. Reversible. Not type 1, but type 2. And 10% of the of the diabetes is type 1. 90% is type 2. So what are we looking at? We're looking at king corn here, right? We're making all of our foods. When you look at the number of foods that we as a culture eat, we're down to about 4 or 5 foods that make up our bulk diet. And corn in the United States is the main big kahuna of those 5 types of foods. But you can see the percentage of corn, some fashion or other, that's in all of these fast foods, which are a huge part of the American diet. So now we're dealing with obesity. Okay, obesity is associated with, of course, diabetes. 60% of us are now overweight, 20% of us are obese, and 2020, 75% of us will be overweight, 40% of us will be obese. Okay, so we have arguments about health care, but this is where the discussions, we should be having discussions as to why this is happening. 100 species of food. I have relatives in Italy. I'm Italian American. So food is sort of like a religion to us. You know, it's one of the cardinal rules. You know, when you eat well because food is part of a ritual, it's part of a sacrament, it's part of a cultural interchange. When you walk around the village my family's from in Italy, every day you smell food 3 times a day coming out of the windows. Everybody cooks, everybody walks, everybody grows food, no matter how small a plot of ground. And agriculturally speaking, Italy was blessed with volcanic calcium soils. All right, that helps. That's why you get that good Seminole flour to make really good pasta. Not to mention the egg yolks that go in there. They don't eat just pasta without the egg yolks. They eat pasta with the egg yolks. You can't make pasta without egg yolks. Right? It doesn't stick together unless you have a high gluten, goopy, you know, Elmer's glue type of spaghetti. Who wants that? With ketchup called tomato sauce. All right? But we can see that they came over here to visit. They were amazed when they went into a grocery store how much what looked like variety until you actually walk around. You have to walk around the perimeter of the grocery store, don't you, to actually get the healthy foods. The stuff in the center of the grocery store is the packaged stuff. Not a place to shop. And this is just the tomato that's grown everywhere. You know, Florida's a big producer. Now, I got to be careful because I know you have laws in Florida that say if you besmirch, you know, produce grown in a particular state like Florida, including the strawberries, you know, it can be a felony. So I'm being taped here. I'm sure I'm going to have, you know, possibly a subpoena that I besmirched a Florida tomato. No, I besmirched all American tomatoes that are grown conventionally. How's that? Including Florida tomatoes. But you can see 2,000 miles of fuel and highway upkeep just to move tomatoes from where they're grown predominantly to where they're consumed. 40 billion pounds of chemical salt fertilizers dumped on U.S. soil annually. We have a problem in the Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary in the United States, by the way, which lost its oysters. It was the oyster capital of the continent at one time. People that live on those islands, they're called watermen. As far as I'm concerned, I visited these people. They're farmers. They farm differently than you might farm, but they're farmers. They harvest 90% of the soft-shell crabs come from Smith Island and the other 2 islands that adjoin those islands. Those islands called Smith Island. Remember Captain John Smith, the English explorer? It was colonized by his people. The cemetery there still has descendants of 1600s that settled those islands. Now the crabs are disappearing because the agricultural runoff and other runoff from septic systems and storm water is entering the bay and eutrophying the water, growing high levels of algae, which of course consume oxygen and sediment and so on. Huge chicken plants along the Delmarva Peninsula. All of this stuff is ending up into this estuary. Now, interestingly enough, the healthiest peoples in the world always lived along estuaries, and they were usually the happiest because you had no heavy lifting. Because food was right there. Everything's there. Fish, crabs, oysters, clams, you know, no heavy lifting. And usually around the estuary there were plenty of native crops and trees that produced the rest of the story, the rest of the diet. And we've destroyed 90-some% of our estuaries in the United States. You know, in New Orleans, off of New Orleans, we have the Gulf of Mexico. We have a dead zone there. That's as big as the state of Connecticut. 8,000 square miles, all from the Mississippi rivers draining the largest agricultural lands. And those are estuaries that produce what? Tremendous amounts of fish and shrimp that kept an economy, a local economy, robust and high-quality foods of the Weston A. Price persuasion. High-quality proteins, high-quality fats, and we're destroying these food-producing areas. And it's coming from, basically, insane practices that are completely unnecessary. But you can see 500 million pounds of pesticides a year, $8 billion in environmental health costs, cancer, maybe. I think there might be a correlation between low, poor nutrition, high levels of toxics. We'll talk about that. So the